The chamber was enormous. That was the first thing anyone noticed when they walked into the Galactic Conclave for the first time. The ceiling stretched so high above your head that the upper galleries disappeared into a soft blue haze. The walls were made of something that looked like crystal, but was actually a living material. It breathed slowly, expanding and contracting in rhythms too subtle for most species to notice. Humans noticed. We always notice things like that. I had been sitting at the human delegation table for about 20 minutes before the session officially began. I was early, which was deliberate. I liked to watch the other delegations arrive. You learn a great deal about people, about any people, human or otherwise, by watching them enter a room when they think no one important is paying attention. The Vreth delegation arrived last, which was also deliberate. 11 representatives in deep violet ceremonial robes, moving in a formation so precise it had clearly been rehearsed. Lord Thessavar led them. He was tall even by Vreth standards, with 4 amber eyes arranged in a slight arc across his broad face, and a way of carrying himself that communicated absolute certainty. He believed today was going to go exactly as planned. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was against conclave protocol to bring personal beverages into the chamber. Nobody had stopped me. Nobody ever did, and I was never sure if that was because they did not notice or because they had already learned it was not worth the conversation. Either way, the coffee was excellent. I had brought it from a small stall outside the transit terminal, run by a Halvari woman who had somehow learned to use a pressurized extraction method that produced something remarkably close to a proper espresso. Small mercies. The session was called to order by the conclave arbiter, a thin gray creature named Suvash, who had held the position for longer than most species in the room had maintained interstellar travel. Suvash announced the session topic in a flat, professional tone, the way you might read a grocery list. The words, however, were not small. The Vreth Empire was formally declaring war on humanity. There was a sound in the chamber that is difficult to describe. It was not quite a gasp, and not quite silence. It was the sound of 400 species simultaneously holding very still. Diplomatic feeds were broadcasting live across 40 star systems. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see what the human ambassador would do. Lord Thessavar stood. His robes caught the chamber light perfectly, and I found myself wondering again whether that was intentional. Probably. The Vreth were very good at theater. He read from a prepared document. His voice was deep and resonant, and carried the kind of authority that comes not from shouting, but from never once having been told no. The charges against humanity were listed in formal language: unauthorized territorial expansion beyond agreed boundary markers, repeated failure to pay what the Vreth called civilization tariffs, fees they believed developing species owed to established powers for the privilege of using shared interstellar infrastructure, and something described, with a perfectly straight face, as cultural non-compliance. That last one almost made me smile. When he finished, he set the document down and looked directly at me. The amber eyes were calm and certain. He had given this speech before, or something very much like it, and it had always worked. The species on the receiving end had always done one of 3 things: protested loudly, offered immediate concessions, or collapsed into frightened silence. He was waiting to see which category humanity fell into. I set my coffee cup down on the table. The sound it made was very small in that enormous room. Then I asked my question. Before we proceed, Lord Thessavar, can you tell me what year your war college last updated its threat assessment on human biology? The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. The previous silence had been anticipation. This one was confusion. Thessavar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, which I had learned was the Vreth equivalent of a slight frown. He had prepared for many possible responses. He had not prepared for that one. Almost against his own will, operating on the instinct of a man who answers direct questions because he has never had reason not to, he said, "Our assessments are current as of 12 cycles ago." I nodded slowly. I wrote something down on the small notepad I kept with me, an actual paper notepad with an actual pen, which caused visible discomfort to several delegates who had not used physical writing implements in living memory. I did not explain what I had written. I did not say anything else. The chamber waited. Thessavar waited. I looked at my notepad. I looked up. I waited a moment more. "Thank you," I said. He stared at me. "You will respond to the declaration." I just did. What followed was the most interesting kind of chaos. The kind that happens entirely in silence. No one raised their voice. No one moved dramatically. But across that vast crystalline chamber, something shifted in the way you can feel a tide turning before you can see it. Delegates began pulling up information on their private screens. Whispered conversations started at the edges of the room. Someone in the third gallery leaned over to a colleague and said something I could not hear, but could read from the shape of it. I understood what was happening in that room, because I understood what my question had actually meant. 12 cycles. In human years, that translated to roughly 47. The last time the Vreth War College had formally studied human beings as a potential military concern, we were still having very loud public arguments about the reliability of our first generation of interstellar drives. We had not yet solved the fuel compression problem. We had colonies on exactly 2 other worlds, both of them small, both of them struggling. That was 47 years ago. In 47 years, a great many things had changed. We had 17 colonial systems. We had survived 3 extinction-level biological events, survived them, contained them, and in one case, developed a treatment that 3 other species had quietly come to us for afterward. We had experienced 2 wars, real wars, against species the Vreth considered their own peer competitors, and we had won both of them. Neither conflict had ever been formally announced. We had not held press events or published victory records. When it was over, we had signed quiet agreements and gone home. This was not an accident. It was a philosophy, developed over a long time by people much smarter than me, about how a young species survives in a galaxy full of established powers who would prefer you stayed small. You do not show your hand. You do not correct their math. You let them keep their old files and their old assumptions, and you keep building, and you stay very, very quiet about what you are building. Across the chamber, a delegate from the Dunhai stood up slowly, gathered his documents, and walked toward the exit. He passed close to the human table. He looked at me for exactly 2 seconds. I gave him a very small nod. He left without a word. The Dunhai knew us. They had every reason to know us well. A Korath delegate had gone very still in her seat, staring at something on her private screen with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone rapidly revising a very significant assumption. Thesavar had noticed none of this yet. He was still focused on me, and his patience had reached its end. He straightened to his full height and declared that unless humanity agreed to surrender 3 border systems within 30 galactic days, the Vreth Empire would begin full military mobilization. Lord Thesavar, I said, and my voice came out the way I wanted it to. Not hard, not soft, simply level. I am not ignoring your declaration. I am giving you the opportunity to retract it before your military advisors have the chance to brief you on what your intelligence division apparently has not. The amber eyes narrowed. He was an intelligent man. That was the thing about Thesavar. He was genuinely intelligent, which meant that somewhere beneath the ceremony and the certainty, a small warning signal was beginning to sound. He did not know yet what it was warning him about, but he heard it. He told me to explain myself. I opened the folder in front of me. Paper again. I heard someone in the gallery make a soft sound of bewilderment, which I found privately charming. I did not read dramatically. I did not stand. I simply read the way you might read a list of items that needed to be dealt with before the end of the day. Human population across all colonial systems. I read the number. Several delegates looked up sharply. Active naval vessels currently commissioned and operational. I read the number. The sharp looks became something closer to alarm. Human soldiers with recorded active combat experience. I read that number too. Then I paused, because the next line deserved its own moment. Of those, I said, approximately 67% have combat experience against a Tier 1 classified species. I will not name which one in this setting, as the relevant treaty remains sealed. However, I will note that several governments represented in this chamber today are fully aware of that engagement and its outcome. The room did not make a sound. Somewhere in the back, a private communication device chimed softly. Then another. Then what sounded like several at once. The conclave's diplomatic feeds were still broadcasting. People across 40 star systems were watching an ambassador read from a paper folder in a quiet voice, and somehow that was more alarming than any speech. Thesavar's aide appeared at his shoulder and bent close. Whatever was said very quietly. I watched Thesavar's face. I had learned to read Vreth expressions over the years, which was not easy, because they were subtle, in ways that did not map onto human emotion in obvious ways. But I had learned. I watched him receive the information. I watched something shift. He asked for a recess. His voice was still formal, still composed, but it was a half-step quieter than it had been. "Of course," I said. I gathered my folder, picked up my coffee cup, and stood. "I will be at the beverage station." The beverage station was a small alcove off the main chamber, stocked with liquids appropriate for about 60 different species biologies. I poured myself a second cup from my own supply, leaned against the counter, and waited. He came alone. No aides, no ceremonial guard. That told me a great deal. When powerful people come to a conversation without witnesses, they have already made a private decision that the public position is no longer the only position. He stood across from me and was quiet for a moment. Outside in the chamber, we could hear the low hum of 400 species having very urgent conversations with very distant governments. "Why the question?" he asked. His voice was different now, still the same deep tone, but the performance had stepped back from it. He was speaking to me, not to a room. "You had the numbers. You had the records. Why not simply present them?" I considered how to answer. There was a simple version and a true version, and in this case, they were the same. Because if I had walked into that chamber and read those numbers from the beginning, I said, it would have looked like a threat, a warning delivered in anger, or in pride, or in the desire to humiliate, and your government would have had to respond to it, not because the math was wrong. The math was always the math, but because being handed an argument by your opponent in front of 400 witnesses on a live broadcast does not allow for a graceful response. You would have had to push back. Pride would have made the numbers impossible to hear. He was watching me carefully. "A question is different," I continued. "A question gives you a moment to pause, and in that pause, something happens. You start thinking. You start searching. You begin to find the answers yourself, or your people find them for you. And when a person discovers something on their own, they believe it in a way they cannot, when it is handed to them by someone with an obvious reason to hand it to them." He was quiet for a long moment. The Vreth, when they were genuinely thinking, went very still. It was one of the things I respected about them. "How did humans learn to do this?" he asked, and the question was sincere. No strategy in it, no attempt to gather information for later use. He simply wanted to know. I drank my coffee. It was still warm. "We had a long time to practice," I said, being underestimated. The declaration of war was formally suspended 3 hours later, pending what the official record described as comprehensive diplomatic review. Within the year, 2 Vreth border systems had opened to human commercial vessels. 3 neutral empires that had never bothered to request formal diplomatic ties with humanity sent representatives to our home system within the following month, each of them carrying very carefully worded messages that said, in their various ways, that they would very much like to have a different kind of relationship going forward. I filed my mission report on the transport home. I always kept them brief. Mission outcome, key exchanges, notable observations. The summary line this time was, engagement concluded without incident, diplomatic standing improved, returning with superior coffee. I leaned back in my seat and watched the stars move outside the small viewport beside me. I thought about the Dunhai delegate who had left the chamber early. I thought about the Korath representative staring at her screen. I thought about all the species in that room who had known, who had seen humans up close, who had fought beside us or against us or simply watched us from a careful distance, and had never said a word to warn the Vreth. Not because they owed us loyalty, they did not, but because they had made the same mistake once, and they understood something the Vreth were only now beginning to learn. We were not loud about what we were. We never had been. We built quietly and moved carefully, and let the galaxy draw its own conclusions from its own old information. And when those conclusions turned out to be wrong, we did not correct them. We simply waited for the moment when someone asked the right question, and answered it ourselves.